Judge laughs at black woman in court, then freezes when she flashes her USSS badge. From the moment Celeste Jordan stepped into the packed Baltimore courtroom, a tense hush rippled through the spectators. She was a black woman facing a judge notorious for his unyielding stare and thinly veiled disdain, a man rumored to render verdicts before a word was spoken. In the echo of nervous whispers and restless shuffling, the judge unleashed a mocking chuckle at Celeste's calm, assertive tone. Then, in a sudden flash of metal and leather, she revealed a United States Secret Service badge, cutting his laughter dead. No one watching could have predicted the swift eruption of karmic justice that followed. Celeste Jordan had never felt more alone than when she walked into the Thurgood Marshall Baltimore City Courthouse on a brisk autumn morning. The cold wind whipped against her cheeks, reddening them, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too focused on the impending court hearing. She had been summoned in a civil matter involving an unscrupulous landlord who accused her of breaching the lease of her modest one-bedroom apartment. It was an absurd case on paper, at least. Yet she'd quickly learned that what seemed absurd on paper often became disturbingly real once it crossed the threshold into a courtroom. The courthouse itself was imposing, a stark stone facade that loomed over passers-by like an austere guardian of secrets. People bustled in and out, some in suits, some in sweatshirts, all with varying degrees of anxiety etched into their features. Celeste couldn't help but notice the sideways glances. Maybe it was her pristine navy pantsuit, or maybe it was the large manila folder she gripped under her arm. But perhaps it was something more insidious, the unspoken prejudice that a black woman appearing confident in a setting like this sometimes elicited. Despite her background, despite her training, Celeste felt a tremor of uncertainty ripple through her. Because in a courthouse, where the gavel reigned supreme, justice sometimes had more to do with power and prejudice than the rule of law. Celeste wasn't always a civilian in a courthouse. Years ago, she had walked halls much like these, in a different capacity. As a special agent with the United States Secret Service, her duty was to protect high-level officials and conduct financial crime investigations. She had stood guard at events where world leaders conversed behind bulletproof glass, her eyes scanning crowds for the slightest hint of danger. That was a side of her life she rarely brought up, both out of a deep-seated sense of duty to secrecy and a desire for personal privacy. After an incident overseas, she had taken an extended leave of absence. Once she returned stateside, she decided to take a break from the daily whirlwind of Secret Service life. Her official affiliation remained, but she shifted gears to focus on healing, finishing graduate-level courses, and then quietly re-entering civilian life. She wanted to experience the world without the constant weight of authority strapped to her waist. That experience had led her here, ironically fighting a petty lawsuit. Despite her background in upholding federal law, Celeste was uncomfortably aware that the color of her skin and the assumptions people made could overshadow everything she'd accomplished. She just didn't expect a simple courtroom hearing to turn into something far more explosive. The presiding judge was the Honorable Joseph Caldwell, a man known around local legal circles for his brusque demeanor and traditional views. Some attorneys whispered that he harbored deep biases that he barely bothered to conceal. Others insisted he was simply old school. As Celeste took her seat in the defendant's chair, she immediately felt a strange energy emanating from the bench. Judge Caldwell was leafing through a file, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. His thinning grey hair was combed back meticulously, and his black robe gathered around his broad shoulders like a symbol of medieval authority. He glanced at Celeste, down at his notes, and then back at Celeste with an unmistakable smirk that curled the corner of his mouth. "Miss Jordan, correct?" he said, barely hiding a tone that dripped with condescension. "You're representing yourself in this matter?" Celeste nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he hummed, setting her file aside. "Well, let's see what we have here," he said, in a voice that suggested he had already decided how the hearing would go. He glanced over at the plaintiff's attorney with a small nod, and Celeste felt her pulse quicken. She had faced down foreign threats and cunning criminals in her past, but she'd never faced such an overt sense of personal bias from someone wearing the robes of justice. The plaintiff's attorney, a tall, self-assured man named Edward Crenshaw, rose to speak. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, and his voice boomed with practiced theatricality. He claimed that Celeste Jordan had consistently failed to pay her rent on time, had violated noise ordinances, and had engaged in suspicious activities that warranted her eviction. Celeste fought to keep her composure. She knew the allegations were baseless. She had documentation showing her on-time payments, and she'd never once been cited for noise complaints by the building or the city. The suspicious activities part was especially ludicrous, likely a reference to her comings and goings at odd hours back when she was still sporadically called in to consult on federal investigations. The building management had noticed and apparently decided to spin it into something ominous. But what troubled her most was the tone. Crenshaw's language dripped with insinuations. He painted a picture of a difficult tenant who didn't fit the building's community standards. It was a dog whistle Celeste recognized all too well, one often used to ostracize someone based on race, class, or profession. Judge Caldwell nodded along, occasionally allowing himself a smirk. Celeste's heart pounded. She began to suspect this was more than just a routine case of landlord-tenant dispute. When it was Celeste's turn to speak, she started by laying out her side in a clear, methodical manner, just as she'd been trained to do in the Secret Service whenever delivering a briefing or testimony. She presented bank statements showing her rent had always been paid online before the due date. She provided a letter from another tenant in the building, attesting that she was a quiet neighbor. She even had screenshots of the building's own email confirmations regarding her rent submissions. Everything was there, laid out in black and white. However, Judge Caldwell barely glanced at her evidence. Instead, he leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk. "You got all that from the internet? Looks like a lot of photocopies and screenshots," he said, peering over his reading glasses. His smirk returned. "Anybody can doctor that stuff these days. Isn't that right, Miss Jordan?" Celeste's stomach churned. She knew that intangible factor of prejudice was at play. Still, she kept her voice steady. "These documents are legitimate, Your Honor. I have notarized copies as well. If you prefer, I can provide the original digital files in court." He let out a small chuckle that caused a rumble of uncomfortable laughter from a few observers in the courtroom. "Don't you worry. We'll sort it out," he said, but his tone suggested anything but fairness. Celeste, however, could see the path forward becoming dangerously narrow. The hearing was nearing its end when Judge Caldwell abruptly declared a recess. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes, he announced. Celeste could feel her palms sweating. In her mind, she tried to strategize her next move. It seemed like no matter what evidence she presented, Caldwell had already formed an opinion. If this escalated, she might be forced to reveal her credentials. Outside in the hallway, Edward Crenshaw caught up with her. "You really should just consider settling," he said in a low voice. "My client is willing to drop the charges if you vacate the property and cover the back rent he believes you owe." "Believes?" Celeste repeated, arching an eyebrow. "I don't know anything," he shrugged. "Well, that's for the court to decide. But you've seen how Caldwell is. You'll lose." His words were a thinly veiled threat, and Celeste felt the anger rising in her chest. But she was no stranger to intimidation tactics. She'd stared down far more threatening figures than Edward Crenshaw. "Thank you for your concern," she replied coolly, "but I think I'll take my chances." Crenshaw flashed a smug grin. "Suit yourself," he said. The undercurrent of certainty in his voice rattled her. Something about the entire situation reeked of injustice and perhaps corruption. By the time the recess was over, Celeste had overheard enough hushed conversations around the corridors to confirm her suspicions. Judge Caldwell had a reputation for leaning heavily against certain defendants. Civil cases involving people of color, and especially black defendants, had a disturbing pattern of unfavorable rulings. Some attorneys even avoided having their clients appear before him if they could. She also overheard a pair of lawyers mention that Caldwell had powerful friends in local real estate circles. Allegations had circulated that he received campaign donations from property owners and developers with deep pockets. None of this was proven, but the whispers were loud enough to raise eyebrows. Celeste quietly seethed. She had spent a career upholding the law, believing wholeheartedly in a system that she now saw failing her on a personal level. A wave of memories washed over her days spent on assignment, nights spent in briefing rooms, the sense of pride she felt every time she pinned on her badge. She had never planned to wield that badge for personal gain, but right now it represented more than just personal authority. It was a testament to her standing as a federal agent who had taken an oath to protect and serve. Perhaps it was time to remind certain individuals that she wasn't a defenseless target. When everyone filed back into the courtroom, Judge Caldwell resumed his seat. He looked at Celeste with a faint sneer. "Miss Jordan, I hope you've had time to think about your actions here." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "Court resources are limited, and you are—" "Excuse me, Your Honor," Celeste interrupted, her voice measured but resolute. She could see the judge's surprise at her interruption, and the sudden hush in the courtroom felt like a vacuum. "Before you continue, I'd like to enter additional evidence into the record that might clarify my position." Judge Caldwell frowned. And what evidence would that be? Instead of speaking immediately, Celeste reached into her bag. Her heart thumped in her chest as she held her Secret Service badge. She had planned to keep it discreet, but the situation demanded a certain level of authority now. Lifting her eyes to meet the judge's, she announced, "I am a special agent with the United States Secret Service, currently on extended leave. I have law enforcement clearance to provide these documents for verification." A stunned silence gripped the room. The judge's eyes flickered with shock, his smirk vanishing instantaneously. A murmur rippled through the seated observers. Celeste placed her badge gently on the defendant's table, letting the polished metal catch the overhead fluorescent light like a silent statement of truth. The metallic glint of the badge seemed to pierce the tension in the room. Judge Caldwell's mouth hung open for a fraction of a second before he recovered, or attempted to. A Secret Service agent," he managed, trying to sound composed but failing as his voice wavered slightly. Celeste nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." He cleared his throat. The transformation was almost comical. The air of arrogance that had cloaked him all morning dissipated in a heartbeat. Now he looked more like a man caught in an unexpected spotlight. That's quite something," he stammered. The plaintiff's attorney, Edward Crenshaw, appeared equally nonplussed. He fiddled with his tie, clearly struggling to maintain his earlier confidence. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see the ramifications of this sudden shift in power dynamics. Celeste let the silence linger. In her line of work, silence was sometimes more potent than words. She picked up her badge and held it in her open palm for the judge to see clearly. "As I mentioned, All the documents I have submitted are verifiable through official channels, she reiterated. And I'm sure the court would not want to question the authenticity of government records. Judge Caldwell swallowed hard, nodding slowly, his eyes never leaving the badge in Celeste's hand. In that moment, Celeste thought back to all the times she'd navigated profiling and racism during her law enforcement career. She had joined the Secret Service in part to break barriers, to show that a black woman could stand on the front lines of national security. And yet, ironically, here she was, in a standard civil court hearing, still having to prove her worth and honesty. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat again, flipping through the papers in front of him with a renewed sense of caution. It seems there may have been a misunderstanding. Let's carefully reassess the evidence, he said, his tone shifting to something resembling professional courtesy. Celeste nodded, but inside her, conflicting emotions churned. She had effectively used her position to level the playing field, but she resented that it had taken a flash of a federal badge to even be treated with basic respect. This hearing was supposed to be about a landlord's bogus charges, not about forcing her to defend her character or prove she wasn't a liar. Still, the moment had an air of poetic justice. Judge Caldwell's earlier haughtiness had all but vanished. Whether he was frightened by the potential ramifications of mistreating a federal agent or finally seeing her as a credible individual, the power dynamic had changed. Now, with a more measured approach, Judge Caldwell began reviewing the documents Celeste had submitted. He asked pointed questions, but this time his tone was less accusatory. He scrutinized the bank statements, the notarized letters, and the screenshots. Occasionally, he looked up at Celeste, his eyes flickering with a mixture of respect and unease. Crenshaw, visibly flustered, attempted to maintain the narrative that Celeste had violated the lease. But each time he proposed an accusation, Celeste calmly discredited it with irrefutable fact. For instance, Crenshaw mentioned a neighbor's complaint about loud music on a certain weekend. Celeste calmly referred to her official travel records, showing she was out of the state during that period, working on a federal assignment. With every piece of evidence that dismantled the plaintiff's case, it became clearer that the lawsuit was baseless. Finally, Caldwell leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples as though grappling with a headache. It appears, Miss Jordan, that many of these allegations cannot be substantiated, he said, looking at the plaintiff's attorney with something akin to annoyance. Celeste exhaled, relief washing over her, but a part of her was still bracing for another twist. The judge might be cornered, but was he willing to rule fairly and tarnish his well-known bias? Just when it seemed like the hearing might end with a dismissal of the plaintiff's claims, a hushed commotion erupted near the back of the courtroom. Two men in dark suits and earpieces had entered quietly, and one of them approached Celeste's table. "Agent Jordan, we need a moment," he whispered. Celeste recognized them as colleagues from a nearby field office. Her mind raced. For them to appear here now meant something urgent must have come up. She cast a quick glance at the judge. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess." Judge Caldwell looked at the two men, their suits and earpieces giving away their federal affiliation. He appeared perplexed but nodded. "Granted," he said, sounding more rattled than ever. The entire courtroom buzzed with confusion as Celeste stepped outside with the agents. The hallway cleared as the men spoke in hushed tones. "There's an ongoing investigation," one agent told her, "and your name came up because you have prior knowledge of certain financial crimes. We need your immediate insight." Celeste's pulse quickened. She had known a day might come when the Secret Service would tap her expertise again. She just hadn't expected it at a moment like this, in the middle of her own legal battles. Torn between her civic duty and her personal predicament, she weighed her next steps carefully. The agents explained that the investigation involved a ring of financial fraudsters targeting federal housing assistance programs. Celeste had worked on a similar case years ago, and her expertise could be crucial. They needed a quick consult, details she might recall, leads she might help them confirm. "I'm in a court hearing," Celeste said, glancing back at the closed doors. "But this case is personal. I can't just walk away." One of the agents, a man with steely grey eyes, offered a sympathetic nod. "We understand, but we also know your current situation on extended leave, dealing with this legal matter. We can wait for you to wrap up. But if you can't—" He stopped, letting the gravity of the situation linger. Celeste felt the weight of duty pressing down. She'd sworn an oath when she joined the Secret Service. Even if she was on leave, that oath didn't expire. She glanced at her watch. If the judge dismissed the case quickly, she could fulfill her obligation without letting her personal life collapse. If Caldwell chose to drag things out, she might be forced to leave and risk an unfavorable ruling or, worse, contempt of court. Finally, Celeste inhaled deeply, making a decision. "Give me just a few more minutes," she said. "Let me see if this can be resolved swiftly." Celeste re-entered the courtroom, her expression controlled but urgent. She caught Judge Caldwell's gaze. For a fleeting moment, she almost felt pity for him. The once confident arbiter of justice now looked like a man trapped in a quagmire of his own making. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs, speculation running wild about who the agents were and why they wanted to speak with Celeste. Clearing her throat, Celeste addressed the judge. "Your Honor, there's an urgent federal matter that requires my attention. As you can see, my colleagues are here. If the court is amenable, I would request we expedite the conclusion of this hearing." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. She could see the wheels turning in his head. If he chose to be vindictive, he could deny her request and force her to stay, potentially damaging her standing with the Secret Service. But doing so would be a gamble, especially now that it was clear Celeste wielded significant credibility and might have powerful allies. "I see," he said, his voice low. He rifled through the papers once more. Finally, he looked at Crenshaw. "Counselor, it appears your client has failed to provide sufficient evidence to support the claims against Miss Jordan. In the interest of justice, I'm inclined to dismiss this case." Crenshaw tried to interject, but Caldwell raised a hand, shutting him down. "Case dismissed," he said flatly. The sharp crack of his gavel signaled the end of what should never have been a battle in the first place. Relief flooded Celeste as she gathered her documents. The humiliation, the tension, and the fear that an unjust system might prevail all dissipated in that single moment. She offered a polite nod to Judge Caldwell, who avoided meeting her eyes. In truth, she suspected this was a case he would never forget, and perhaps it would serve as a lesson about snap judgments and bias. As she left the courtroom, Crenshaw, red-faced and flustered, attempted to catch her attention. "Miss Jordan, if you'd just—" But Celeste didn't slow down. She had nothing more to say to the man who had tried to ruin her life with baseless accusations. The corridor seemed brighter now, the tension replaced by a sense of triumph and vindication. Her federal colleagues, still waiting, observed her exit. One of them smiled. "All good?" Celeste nodded. "Case dismissed," she said with a hint of a smile. "Glad to hear it," the agent replied. "We need you, though. The Bureau is swamped with this operation." She nodded, switching gears mentally from defendant to federal agent. It was a stark reminder. No matter how personal life got, her duty to protect and uphold the law was never far behind. Together, they headed out of the courthouse, leaving behind a swirl of gossip, shock, and the echoes of a judge's laughter that had turned to stunned silence. Outside, the crisp autumn air hit Celeste like a reminder of her reality. She felt a surge of adrenaline mingled with exhaustion. She had just fought one battle, and now she was about to dive into another. As the agents escorted her to an unmarked SUV, her phone buzzed. It was her landlord, or rather, her soon-to-be former landlord, sending her a string of texts that ranged from accusatory to apologetic. She skimmed them quickly. I never intended for it to go this far. The attorney said we could get some settlement. I'm sorry. Celeste almost laughed at the irony. Moments earlier, she'd been the one cornered, forced to reveal her credentials. Now it seemed the power had shifted entirely. She decided she could deal with him later, perhaps through a formal complaint or legal action for wrongful harassment. The agents shared more details about the case at hand. A sophisticated group had been falsifying identities and stealing funds earmarked for low-income housing, funneling them into offshore accounts. Celeste's past investigations had led her to a ring with a similar modus operandi years ago. If it was the same operation, they might be on the verge of a major bust. Despite everything that had happened that day, Celeste felt a renewed sense of purpose. Fighting injustice was, after all, what she did best. They drove to a federal building downtown, not far from the courthouse. Once inside, Celeste was struck by how familiar the environment felt. The stark white walls, the secure doors requiring ID badges, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It was like stepping back into a life she had only partially left behind. Her boss, Assistant Special Agent in Charge ASAC Maria Whitaker, greeted her with a handshake and a relieved smile. Celeste, sorry to pull you in on short notice, but we need you. We've got fresh intel that indicates the group we've been tracking may have connections to a judge in the city. Celeste froze. A judge? Maria nodded, eyes narrowing. Potentially. We're not sure which, but we've got reason to believe there's been a pattern of laundering money through real estate deals that might involve corrupt officials. You worked a parallel case in Chicago, right? Yes, I did, Celeste said, feeling her stomach twist. It's eerily similar. They used shell companies to buy up properties, then funneled illicit funds through rental income and inflated lease agreements. Maria grabbed a file from a nearby desk and handed it to Celeste. We suspect something similar here in Baltimore. We could use any insight you have, especially if it ties back to known individuals. Celeste nodded grimly. Her mind wandered briefly to Judge Caldwell. Could it be a coincidence that he was rumored to be cozy with certain real estate interests? Celeste combed through the file, scanning pages of reports, wire transfer documentation, and surveillance photos. The operation's sophistication was impressive. They targeted vulnerable neighborhoods, snapping up foreclosed homes, flipping them under shell corporations, and then leasing them at inflated prices sometimes to renters who had no idea they were being exploited. The paper trail revealed an elaborate network of LLCs, each hiding behind another layer of anonymity. Amid the data, Celeste found mention of a local property owners association that had made questionable donations to a municipal judge's campaign. The name was redacted in the file, but her thoughts darted to Caldwell. Could he be the one? The man had proven himself more than capable of bending the scales of justice. "What are you thinking?" Maria asked, noticing the change in Celeste's expression. "I'm not sure yet," Celeste replied carefully. She wanted more evidence before jumping to conclusions. "But I do see some parallels to a case we had in Chicago, where a judge was implicated. The MO is the same, manipulating property deals, funneling money through local politics. Let me cross-check some references from my old case files." Maria nodded. "Do it. We've got a small team ready to assist." The higher-ups want a preliminary briefing by the end of the week. Celeste pushed aside her personal animosity toward Caldwell, focusing on the objective, uncovering the truth. Yet a dark sense of irony clung to her thoughts. She had just faced potential injustice at the hands of a corrupt system, and now she might be unraveling corruption within that system itself. Over the next 2 days, Celeste worked almost around the clock, rarely leaving the federal building except to grab a few hours of sleep in a nearby hotel. She pored over old case notes, cross-referenced data, and met with intelligence analysts who had been on the Baltimore investigation for months. The deeper she dug, the more it looked like a judge in the area was indeed involved. At least 3 large real estate deals had gone through under questionable circumstances, each receiving favorable rulings in civil court cases. Companies tied to the deals had made sizable campaign contributions to a single judge, although the name remained redacted in official documents until probable cause was established. Celeste could do the math. The timelines, the rumored shady connections, the real estate bias, it all pointed like a neon sign to Joseph Caldwell. Still, Celeste needed irrefutable proof. A federal warrant or search would require a solid foundation, and Caldwell was no fool. He had likely covered his tracks well. However, the pattern was undeniable: property disputes that ended suspiciously in the owner's favor. Large campaign donations appearing right after the rulings. Shell corporations paying consulting fees to a law firm believed to be connected to the judge's family. Celeste felt a surge of grim determination. If Caldwell was abusing the bench for personal gain and simultaneously promoting racial and social injustice, he needed to be stopped. This was her chance not only to protect unsuspecting citizens, but also to right a personal wrong she had experienced just days earlier. By the 3rd day, preliminary evidence was strong enough for an official briefing. Maria arranged a meeting with the local U.S. attorney and a small group of senior agents. Celeste presented her findings in a succinct PowerPoint deck, showcasing the financial flows, the shell corporations, and the suspicious rulings. Everyone in the room listened intently. As she concluded, Maria spoke up. "We believe Judge Joseph Caldwell is at the center of this. The chain of evidence strongly suggests he has manipulated court rulings for personal and financial gain. If this is true, it's a major breach of public trust." The U.S. attorney leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "We'll need to be cautious. Taking down a sitting judge is no small feat." Celeste nodded. "Agreed. We'll need a sealed investigation, wiretaps, witness interviews before we move forward with an indictment." The U.S. attorney tapped his pen on the table. "We need probable cause. That's rock solid. Keep digging." He turned to Celeste. "Agent Jordan, you've got personal knowledge of Caldwell, correct?" She hesitated. "I appeared in his court recently, yes, and let's just say I saw firsthand how he operates." The U.S. attorney steepled his fingers. "Then you know how risky this is. We proceed carefully or not at all." Celeste understood the gravity. The system had cracks, and they were about to pry one wide open. The next steps could set the stage for Caldwell's downfall or put Celeste's career on the line if the evidence didn't hold up. Within a week, the investigation escalated. The team secured a sealed court order, allowing them to discreetly wiretap phone lines associated with the suspicious real estate group. They couldn't directly target Caldwell without more evidence, but tapping the group might yield enough incriminating conversations to form a case against him. Celeste spent countless hours reviewing transcripts from these wiretaps. Conversations about property deals, hush payments, and even coded references to our friend at the courthouse emerged. The deeper Celeste went, the clearer it became that Caldwell was receiving kickbacks in exchange for favorable judgments. One evening, Celeste came across a particularly damning conversation. The ringleader of the real estate group, identified only by an alias Monarch, was speaking to an attorney about making sure the judge is happy before the next ruling. They discussed transferring funds into a shell company account. The date of the deposit lined up precisely with a key hearing on a contested property dispute. Celeste's pulse raced. She began to see how these criminals operated with near impunity, seemingly confident no one would uncover their scheme. But now she had them cornered. The next challenge would be ensuring the evidence pointed unmistakably to Caldwell and preparing for the legal firestorm that would follow once the allegations went public. As the investigation intensified, Celeste faced a personal dilemma. She could recuse herself from the final takedown, arguing a conflict of interest. After all, Caldwell had presided over her own case. If the defense learned she had personal motivations, they might argue entrapment or bias. But if she stepped aside, she'd lose the chance to help ensure justice was served, especially for the countless tenants who never had the advantage of brandishing a Secret Service badge to defend their rights. Maria was the first to bring it up. "Celeste, we have to consider optics. Caldwell's defense attorneys will seize on any hint of personal vendetta." Celeste sighed. "I know, but no one on this team has the same background on these shell corporations that I do, and that knowledge could be the key to unraveling the entire operation." Maria nodded. "We need you, but be prepared for a fight. They'll come after your credibility." Celeste nodded. "Let them. The evidence will speak for itself." She paused, thinking of how Caldwell had dismissed her evidence in court. "I'm done letting bullies and bigots hide behind the bench." That night, Celeste couldn't sleep. Memories of the courtroom fiasco intermingled with the hundreds of tenant cases piling up in her mind. She realized she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was standing up for all those who'd been steamrolled by a system meant to protect them. After gathering enough wiretap evidence, the team devised a plan to catch the conspirators in real time. The real estate group was scheduling a meeting in a luxury hotel suite to finalize a major property deal. Rumor had it that Caldwell would receive a substantial consulting fee afterward, funneled through an intermediary. Celeste went undercover as a financial advisor with connections to offshore accounts, a guise she'd assumed before in previous operations. It was risky, but her knowledge of the group's strategies gave her a credible edge. She wore a discreet wire, while a backup team waited nearby, ready to swoop in once she confirmed the transfer and any direct mention of the judge. Entering the swanky penthouse suite, Celeste was greeted by three men in tailored suits. They offered her champagne and launched into a sales pitch about the investment opportunities they had. Celeste nodded along, feigning interest while skillfully guiding the conversation toward the judge's role. Eventually, one of the men, a suave operator going by the name Timothy, let slip, "We've got the judge in our pocket. He'll make sure any legal issues disappear." He exchanged knowing glances with the others. Celeste's hidden recorder picked up every syllable. It was the smoking gun they needed. Once Celeste had enough confirmation, she activated the signal for the takedown. Within minutes, federal agents stormed the suite, guns drawn, commanding everyone to freeze. The suspects, caught off guard, tried to scramble for their devices and documents, but the agents confiscated everything. Celeste, pulling off her undercover persona with a flourish, flashed her Secret Service badge. The men recognized her with dawning horror. Immediately, the agents scoured the suite, collecting laptops, burner phones, and a stack of manila envelopes stuffed with cash. It was all the proof they needed to build a bulletproof case. One of the suspects, a nervous man wearing gold cufflinks, cracked under pressure and started babbling about how the money was meant for Judge Caldwell's foundation. Celeste listened intently, a mixture of relief and anger coursing through her. The conspirators would face charges that ranged from money laundering to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and at the center of it all loomed the involvement of Judge Joseph Caldwell, the very man who had tried to dismiss Celeste's evidence in a petty landlord-tenant case. She stepped outside onto the hotel balcony, inhaling the cool morning air. Dawn was breaking over the skyline. In that quiet moment, Celeste understood the gravity of what she had accomplished. Justice was no longer a distant hope, but a reality closing in fast. With the sting operation concluded, the U.S. attorney moved swiftly. Over the next 48 hours, a flurry of legal activity ensued, culminating in a sealed indictment against Joseph Caldwell. Agents meticulously prepared an arrest warrant, citing evidence from wiretaps, financial records, and witness testimonies. The moment was heavy with significance. It wasn't every day that a sitting judge faced such serious charges. Celeste was part of the briefing. She stood in the back of the room, arms folded, listening as the U.S. attorney laid out the plan. "We'll execute the arrest first thing in the morning," he said. "We don't want to give him any chance to flee or destroy evidence." Maria caught Celeste's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come. This was the day of reckoning. That night, Celeste tried to sleep, but her mind whirled with memories of Caldwell's dismissive laughter. She wondered if he'd greet the agents with the same smug arrogance, or if he'd finally realized the gravity of his actions. One thing was certain: a storm was coming, and Caldwell's carefully curated facade of legitimacy was about to be torn to shreds. At dawn, a team of federal marshals and Secret Service agents arrived at Caldwell's upscale home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sprawling two-story house had manicured lawns and a stone driveway, an outward symbol of the privilege Caldwell had enjoyed. But no amount of grandeur could protect him from the law's reach. Celeste waited in a car nearby. She wasn't part of the entry team. It was deemed more prudent for her to remain on standby due to her personal involvement in the case. Still, she watched intently as the marshals knocked on Caldwell's door, their badges held high. After a tense minute, the judge appeared, clad in a silk robe. Surprise and then panic flickered across his face. The lead marshal stepped forward. "Joseph Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and misuse of judicial authority." Caldwell's voice quivered with indignation. "This is outrageous. I am a judge, for heaven's sake." But the marshals pressed forward, reading him his rights. By the time they cuffed him, his anger had given way to visible fear. From a distance, Celeste felt an odd mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The law would have its day, but the damage Caldwell inflicted on countless lives remained. Still, this was the first step toward rectifying those wrongs. News of Caldwell's arrest spread like wildfire through Baltimore's legal community. Court hearings paused as attorneys, clerks, and judges alike gaped at the headlines. Local media outlets seized on the scandal, running exposes on Caldwell's history of suspicious rulings and political contributions. Tenants who had lost their homes under his gavel began to come forward with renewed hope of legal recourse. Celeste observed the unfolding spectacle with a sense of vindication. She knew the real battle was only just beginning: the trial, the legal maneuvering, the attempts by Caldwell's allies to downplay or dismiss the charges. But the tide of public opinion had already turned against him. Meanwhile, Edward Crenshaw, the plaintiff's attorney from Celeste's landlord-tenant case, found himself under scrutiny. While he wasn't implicated in the main conspiracy, some of his past dealings with Caldwell were being questioned. Word on the street was that he'd lost several high-profile clients overnight. His smug grin from that courtroom felt like a distant memory now. Karma, it seemed, had its own timetable, but was relentless once it arrived. And for Celeste, this moment felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted her, proof that justice, while delayed, was not denied. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Caldwell's defense team tried to spin the story. They painted him as a victim of an overzealous federal investigation and insisted that the real culprits were the unscrupulous real estate moguls. But leaked transcripts of the wiretapped conversations told a different story, one of a judge who actively colluded to enrich himself, disregarding the welfare of those who came seeking justice. Protests erupted outside the courthouse where Caldwell had once presided. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for all, not just the wealthy, and no one is above the law," dotted the sidewalks. Former defendants recounted horror stories of biased rulings, painting a picture of a judge who systematically disadvantaged those without power or privilege. Through it all, Celeste kept a low profile. She'd provided her testimony under seal, given her involvement in the sting and her status as a Secret Service agent. Though reporters tried to dig into how Caldwell's downfall had started, the Justice Department kept her role under wraps for security reasons. Privately, though, Celeste understood the importance of her actions. By standing up in that courtroom, by refusing to bow to prejudice, she'd lit the spark that would eventually blaze through Caldwell's entire corrupt empire. The trial was swift and damning. Witness after witness testified about how Caldwell had steered rulings in favor of wealthy property owners who funneled money into his campaign funds or personal shell accounts. Financial experts took the stand to confirm the money laundering trails. A parade of victims recounted how they'd lost their homes or faced unjust legal actions. The final blow came when the ringleaders of the real estate group, seeking reduced sentences, flipped on Caldwell and described in detail how he had orchestrated the scheme. When the jury returned its verdict guilty on multiple counts, the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. Caldwell slumped in his seat, the black robe of his former station replaced by a simple suit and an expression of utter defeat. Outside, as the crowd gathered to celebrate, Celeste stood on the courthouse steps. She felt a mix of relief and resolve. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about a system that still had cracks. But today proved that those cracks could be sealed if enough people fought for what was right. In the weeks that followed, the state conducted reviews of every case Caldwell had touched in recent years, opening opportunities for appeals. Justice, though belated, would ripple outward, touching the lives of those who had lost faith. And for Celeste, the episode affirmed her belief in her calling both as a federal agent and as a citizen who refused to let prejudice rule. One late afternoon, Celeste returned to the Thurgood Marshall Baltimore City Courthouse, not as a defendant, not as an agent on duty, but as a private citizen. She walked the halls that once had felt oppressive and hostile. Today, they seemed a little brighter, a little more open. A few clerks even recognized her, nodding in acknowledgement and gratitude. She made her way to the small claims office, where she picked up papers to file a formal complaint against her former landlord. Though the civil case had been dismissed, she now had grounds for damages: lost time, legal fees, and the emotional toll. This wasn't about the money. It was about reminding those who might exploit the legal system that the law served everyone equally. Glancing around, she saw people waiting on benches, some anxious, some resigned, some hopeful. She wanted to tell them, don't give up. After all, she had nearly lost her faith not long ago. But standing there in that hallway, aware that the system had worked in the end, albeit with forceful intervention, she felt a renewed sense of optimism. Before leaving, she paused in front of an old plaque commemorating civil rights pioneers who had once fought battles in these very halls. Thurgood Marshall's bronze likeness stared back at her, a silent reminder of the long road to justice. She was part of that legacy now, in her own small way. Exiting the courthouse, she took a deep breath of fresh air. In the distance, she could hear the bustling sounds of the city car horns, pedestrian chatter, the rhythm of everyday life. Somewhere in that mix were people who would never know her name or her story, but who would benefit from the stand she took. As she walked away, she felt the weight of her Secret Service badge in her bag. It was more than just an ID. It was a testament to the ideals she served. One day, she'd return to her full duties, prepared to face whatever threats lay ahead. But for now, she carried with her the knowledge that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never truly lost when we choose to fight for it. Celeste's battle reminds us that the pursuit of justice is a marathon, not a sprint. Sometimes the system we believe in can falter, revealing its flaws in the most harrowing ways. Yet through resilience, courage, and a steadfast commitment to truth, Celeste shattered the chains of bias and corruption. She not only vindicated herself, but also illuminated the path for countless others silenced by prejudice. Her moment of triumph underscores that everyone, no matter their background, deserves fairness under the law. If this story resonated with you, please remember to like this video, share it with your community, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of perseverance and justice. Your support helps us continue to spotlight narratives that inspire change. Together, we can stand up for what's right, ensuring that integrity prevails in every walk of life.